Welcome to Everything History for episode 10, The Heart of the French Revolution. This episode is a little different because I had so many awesome sources and wrote so much material that I've had to cut it down the middle. I could have cut up the material more so, but we're in July of 1789. This is the beating heart of the French Revolution, and it's tough sledding to make it through. Don't worry though, once we get through the momentous days of July, the podcast will quicken up again. Was that a long enough intro for you?
I discharged my last duty as King and Emperor.
This is Everything History.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time.
I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
Previously on Everything History, we covered events from 1787 to late June 1789. In particular, in the last episode, we experienced the difficulties of the Estates General of 1789. The tension between the social classes led to gridlock and made the Assembly of the Three Estates all but useless. In early June, the Third Estate delegates began calling themselves the Commons, and with the support of the public, they decided to take action by themselves. They created the National Assembly to serve as the legislative body of France. And after a great struggle and massive public protest, on June 27th, King Louis was forced to recognize the authority of the National Assembly, and the French Revolution was now fully underway. That about brings us back up to date, and I left off in episode 9 noting that the power structure in France had shifted dramatically out of the hands of the monarchy, and I had intended to tie this in with the dinner between Jefferson, Morris, and Lafayette that was discussed in the beginning of the last episode, but I admit I failed to do so, which is why I'll do it now. For those of you who do not remember, Jefferson and Morris advised Lafayette right before the beginning of the Estates General that what France needed more than anything was leadership. If the king or government failed to lead, they told Lafayette in an eloquent statement that it was the duty of the people to lead in their stead. And that is exactly what happened in June. The National Assembly and the common citizens began to lead France, and their leadership role was made official by King Louis XVI's public announcement on the 27th of June that recognized the National Assembly. But Louis actually went further than that in his statement. He compelled the rest of the nobility and clergy delegates to join the assembly as well. This move by the king was looked down upon by the First and Second Estates because they saw it as a concession. Yet when we look back on it, we see that the First and Second Estates were really looking at it wrong, for the king did not really have a choice. Thousands, or according to some, tens of thousands of people were in the streets across the nation. The situation was absolutely unprecedented. Due to this, Louis really had no choice. He needed to concede to the National Assembly or he would have started a civil war. That is no euphemism or use of figurative language either. I mean that literally. If King Louis had ordered the military to attack or break up the crowds, then all hell would have broke loose in France. I really don't have to defend that statement either, because in a little over 2 weeks, that would actually happen. So I'll let history speak for itself in just a moment. And our American historical friend, Mr. Morris, understood this well enough. He wrote on June 27th in his diary, quote, "At length the great question is determined. It remains only for them, the Assembly, to form a constitution. And as the king is extremely timid, he will of course surrender to discretion. The existence of the monarchy therefore depends on the moderation of the Assembly." End quote. What Morris tells us strikes to the core of our story, and solidifies two things. One, the Estates General was dead. And two, the monarchy in the House of Bourbon was now on the hot seat. Last episode I said they were on the deathbed. That turn of phrase still works as well. And while that is, historically speaking, true, we must exercise caution with such sweeping statements. For in the perspective of the common French citizen at this moment, the monarchy appeared strong as ever. They were just finally doing the right thing and taking France into the modern age of nations. Indeed, the people even chanted "Vive le Roi," which means "Long live the king," when the king came to his balcony to greet the thousands of citizens in the royal palace after the recognition of the National Assembly. Many thought this was even the conclusion of France's chaotic journey. The president of the National Assembly himself, Jean Bailly, even compared it to the unification of a family. The king was the pater, the father, the men of the assembly his brothers, and the people his children. The author Simon Schama does extremely well at showing this very perspective. I will read it in its entirety. He tells us that the king was very much worried about his future, but when he went upon the balcony to meet the people, quote, all these reservations were swept aside in a great surge of popular celebration out of doors. The streets of Versailles were illuminated. Firecrackers exploded into the afternoon air. Singing and dancing crowds packed the courtyards and streets leading to the palace, shouting Vive Necker, and at least as often Vive le Roi. Persuaded of the benign mood of the people, Louis and Marie Antoinette made an impromptu appearance. They stood on the balcony of Louis XVI's bedroom, overlooking the Cour des Maubois. They tried to look happy. Louis even made an attempt at a wave. But it was the Queen who had the cynosure of all eyes, not because of the magnificence of her appearance, but the humility. The sorrow of the death of her son had noticeably grayed her hair, which was wore down over her shoulders like a citizeness. There were no jewels to be seen, either. She turned inward to the room and, fighting back tears, brought before the amazed crowd her 2 children. Together, papa, maman, enfants, with blonde curls tumbling to their shoulders, stood quietly before the people, cheering themselves hoarse. It was the first of many such encounters to come, few of them this affable. For the moment, though, the sight of them gave fresh meaning to Bailly's remark earlier that afternoon. Quote, now the family is complete. End quote. Oh, I tell you, you can feel the sentiment in those words. And for France's sake, I really wish that sentiment was to last. But it was not. Marquis de Ferrières sums up exactly why the very next day, the 28th, in a letter to his sister. Quote, everything now seems tranquil. However, the Garde Française, the French Guard, no longer acknowledge their officers. The defection of troops is general and everything announces a great revolution. The Estates General of 1789 will be celebrated but by a banner of blood that will be carried to all parts of Europe. Adieu, my good sister. The state of affairs is not very comforting. End quote. There's obviously a dichotomy there. Was France coming together to promote prosperity, or was it about to explode into bloodshed? Everyone hoped that it was the former, and that some sort of calm was on the way. That was not the case, though, because the public unrest did not subside. The thousands of restless citizens continued to clog the streets, and this began to worry even those in the National Assembly. But why did the crowds not subside? Well, that is a hard question to answer. We must try and decipher it, though. And, well, firstly, it takes a while for tens of thousands of people to actually settle down, and many of them were unemployed or so poor that they might as well have been, so to them there was no point in getting out of the streets anyways. And that's all very true, but a prominent point that many historians and researchers point to is that the people were still skeptical of the monarchy, the aristocracy, and the government at large. They suspected or feared that the king would go back on his promises. So what better way to prevent the government from wiggling its way back into feudalism than to congest the streets of the major cities? And that seems very plausible. But whatever the reason, the continued protests held France in stasis. As long as they continued on and protest, the economy would not function, and the government would be constantly looking over its shoulder to see how angry the mob of people were. And as June was about to turn to July, the king tried to be the peacekeeper here and called in more regiments of the French Guard to break up the mobs in Versailles and Paris. The problem was, revolutionary and patriotic sentiment was spreading like influenza. The French Guard had been suffering along with the people. Most had actually not received pay in weeks or even months, and they had began to side with the new patriot cause. And being patriotic evidently meant doing whatever you pleased as long as it was directed towards the government. The French Guard was experiencing hundreds of desertions, and many more were disobeying orders in the name of revolution. In the city of Lyon, citizens were refusing to pay the tax on grain, and in Paris, citizens and soldiers alike were attacking customs officials. And throughout the nation, bakers and their shops were being raided frequently and forced to either board up their shops or leave the country. There are many more examples of this sort of unrest, but what it all says is that France had now entered revolutionary anarchy. Now in the past, I've used the word anarchy quite a lot, so let me define it to make it clear. Anarchy is a state of disorder due to non-recognition of authority. So yes, indeed, France was in anarchy. Okay, let me halt here just a moment. In the month of July, which we are now entering, King Louis XVI is going to make a series of mistakes. Really big ones, too. And when they occur, I will simply say mistake number 1, mistake number 2, etc. And I will bring these mistakes back up at the beginning of next episode to allow some clarity between the transition of episodes, and to have a little bit of fun. The authority over the military was still apparently with the king, and he tried, once more, on July 1st to reinstitute law and order, this time through the persuasion of force. He ordered 20,000 soldiers to move upon Paris and Versailles. They weren't meant to engage, though, only to contain the crisis, at least for the moment, and many of the soldiers were actually mercenaries because Louis no longer trusted his own forces, which he was very much right to do, by the way, considering the recent failure of the French Guard. This massive force sent fear and panic through the communities in Versailles and Paris, and they looked to the National Assembly for guidance. Many even feared that the king was trying to eliminate the National Assembly. President Bailly of the National Assembly himself expressed this language, saying, quote, 30 regiments were marching on Paris. The pretext of the force was the maintenance of public order. The true purpose was the dissolution of the Assembly. So, according to the French Patriots' perspective, the king was attempting to seize power, or seize back power. And we gotta halt there, too, because we gotta sort out this mess. What was the king's actual reasoning? Did he truly want to overpower the National Assembly? Well, it is no mystery to say that the king and queen were disgruntled about the concessions they had been forced to give, but it is reaching to assume that the king wanted to forcibly remove the National Assembly. That would have been entirely out of character for Louis XVI. That being said, his reasoning wasn't all about peace. A primary purpose of the military presence was intimidation. The king was trying to force progress and mainly stabilization through a military presence, not through military force, and there is a big difference. Now, that was the monarchy's perspective, and whatever the case was, whichever perspective was more accurate there, the calling of the 20,000 soldiers to the capital was mistake number 1, and it happened on the very first day of July. This move would prove to be a fatal blunder by King Louis because the patriot mob was going to call his bluff. Before that, though, the National Assembly attempted diplomacy with King Louis. On July 8th, led by Mirabeau, the Assembly requested the full withdrawal of the army. On July 10th, the king responded callously. He claimed that the troops were there for protection and to prevent further riots like that of Rebellion in April. Not a single man in the National Assembly believed the king, though. They fully expected the king to use the military to re-seize power in France. Mirabeau then proceeded to rile up all of the assembly by saying, quote, have they studied in the history of all peoples how revolutions begin? End quote. The assembly boomed at the apparent audacity of the king, and their untrusting views quickly spread to the people. Now, I wouldn't say the king's response was a mistake there. That was a correct move, or at least a decent one. But on July 11th, the king made a very large one. Mistake, that is. Ever since the beginning of 1789, the queen, Marie Antoinette, had disapproved of Jacques Necker, the financial minister. She believed him to be conniving and a corrupting force, and during June and July she had whispered to Louis over and over for the dismissal of Necker. She wasn't the only one saying these things, and she may have even been correct. Necker had, after all, committed fraud several times, but the public had no idea about that, and they liked him. Remember on the 27th of June, what had the people been shouting? Long live the king, yes, but also long live Necker. And it needs pointing out that nobody said long live the queen. They didn't say death to the queen either, but my point is, she was not well liked, certainly not as much as Necker. And around July 11th, she got her way. Necker and 3 other ministers were fired, and that was mistake number 2 by King Louis. And the people immediately saw the hand of the queen in this maneuver, and it was a horrible political move by Louis. The people adored and loved Necker, and when the news of his dismissal broke out on the 12th, all semblance of peace would be shattered. This royal decision and the decision to keep the army encamped outside Paris would have violent ramifications. The reason for this is due to fear. The assembly and the people now expected King Louis to use the army to reproclaim his absolute sovereignty once more. More than that, they feared the return of the old regime and the ways of feudalism and despotism. And these were valid fears, too. On top of that, King Louis fires half of his privy council, one of them being a hero of the people. That was absolutely awful timing, because what does that look and or sound like? It sounds like the king is clearing house. And when you combine all that together, what do you, the people, think is going to happen? I dare say you foresee a military coup d'etat by King Louis XVI and his meddling queen. Whether or not that is the case, or the truth, does not matter. What does matter is that the people expect it and are going to fight it. Indeed, everyone sensed a massive power struggling coming on. Shops and theaters even closed for mourning, fully expecting a sorrowful display of civil warfare. And during the day, on July 12th, the soldiers moved into Paris. During the early hours, they met with little resistance, and the people were scuttled off the streets by cavalry. The soldiers were so far maintaining discipline, but as the hours ticked by, it only got more difficult to keep the peace in Paris. We must also keep in mind the food and living situation in France, and especially Paris, where much of this is going down. It is paramount to this situation, and even conservative papers wrote of the deplorable situation. A paper called The Friend of the King wrote, quote, "There was frequent bloodshed. Workshops were deserted. Workmen and craftsmen found themselves unable to pay for even the next day's supply of bread. The bread, moreover, was far from being of good quality. It was generally blackish, earthy, and sour. Swallowing it scratched the throat, and digesting it caused stomach pains. I saw flour, too, of terrible quality. Disgusting smelling yellow mounds which produced such rock-hard lumps of bread that it could only be divided up with the use of an axe." End quote. And the cherry on top? Bread prices were the highest they'd been in 20 years. And continuing on that line of thought, that same paper asked a question I'm sure many of you are curious about. How are the privileged eating? So the author of The Friend of the King went to Versailles and wrote, quote, "I was curious to see what kind of bread was being eaten at court, or served at the ministers' and deputies' tables. Nowhere could I even find rye bread. Everywhere I saw only beautiful bread, of the finest quality, served in great abundance." End quote. And that was from a paper that supported the monarchy. And don't delude yourself, the people were fully aware of this rich privilege, and no longer were they going to stand for it. And I even get a little emotional, a little bit angry, even reading those texts, for they spoke to the heart of the matter. Well-born people ate and lived lavishly, while everyone else was beating each other bloody, literally, for, quote, "blackish, earthy, and sour bread." Did people really think this could last? Actually, that reminds me of Selina Kyle, aka Catwoman, from The Dark Knight Rises. She said to Bruce Wayne in that story, quote, "There's a storm coming, Mr. Wayne. You and your friends better batten down the hatches, because when it hits, you're all going to wonder how you ever thought you could live so large and leave so little for the rest of us." End quote. It's amazing how right Selina Kyle was and how relevant that statement is. And it's difficult to say if they, the aristocracy, was even aware of the standard of living massive chasm of a gap between them and the common people. Truthfully, I believe they were overwhelmingly ignorant of the reality of France. However, as night fell on the 12th of July, all ignorance to reality was going to be wiped away. Yes, as night descended on Paris, revolution dawned, and there was no looking back. Thomas Jefferson, who needs no introduction, was witness to these events, wrote in a letter to John Jay, quote, "The people now armed themselves with such weapons as they could find in armorers' shops and private houses, and were roaming all night through all parts of the city without any decided or practicable object." End quote. And when the soldiers began to realize what was happening, their discipline and loyalty waned rapidly. The Swiss Guard and most of the foreign regiments held firm, but the French Guard not only disobeyed orders, they joined the patriot mobs. Yes, the king's own French Guard joined and yelled the now popular phrase, quote, "We are citizens before soldiers, Frenchmen before slaves." With the new support, the mob was now extremely confident as the hour neared midnight. And when you mix confidence, hunger, and weapons with a mob, the results are frightening. Skirmishes broke out between the two militarized forces, but the commanders of the king's soldiers wisely pulled out of Paris and back to their encampments. This prevented massacre, but left Paris to the discretion of the mob. They attacked and burned customs houses, toll gates, and gatehouses until the city burned once more. Within an hour, the insurrection had surpassed in all forms the Réveillon riots of April, and the escalation continued throughout the night and into the morning. By the morning of the 13th, the property owners of Paris were so scared that they tried to form a militia to curb the spread of the chaos, but it was far too late. One member wrote, quote, "We made a sorry showing. We could not contain the people's fury. They would have exterminated us. It is not the moment to reason with them." End quote. And they were very much in the right to get out of the way, for the people, the Citizen Patriots, were on the warpath. After having looted every armory, gunsmith, and shop during the night, they set their eyes on finding grain and food. They had long suspected that the government had been holding back grain, and they weren't wrong. At the Abbey of St. Lazare, stockpiles of grain, wine, and cheese were discovered. The mob worked itself into a fury when they discovered this, and committed vile acts of blasphemy on the site. They attempted to lynch clerics, they bashed in depictions from the Bible, looted the abbey, threw down the cross, and torched the monastery. The black suspicions of the Citizen Patriots had been validated, and it only added fuel to the fire. So what did King Louis do with his military that had evacuated the city last night? He did nothing. He deferred all action to his commanders, and none of them did anything until the situation had gotten completely out of hand. This was mistake number 3 by Louis XVI. I'll explain why later on. In the meantime, as the Swiss and Austrian troops stood idle, the chaos of revolution had spread to Versailles, and it was in the early afternoon of the 13th that it was discovered that Necker had been fired. It seems that the citizens had been relatively unaware of this fact, but their leaders used Necker's firing as a motivational weapon, and boy did it work. Everything in the previous day, which had already been the most calamitous uprising France had ever experienced, was about to be eclipsed. Yes, a rallying cry for revolution, Vive la Révolution, spread across Versailles, Paris, and France like a cork out of a bottle. And all protest and action began to center around the royal palace in Versailles. A speaker named Desmoulins rallied the people and whipped them into a frenzy, saying, quote, "Listen to Paris, Rayon, Bordeaux, Calais, and Marseille. From one end of the country to the other, the same universal cry is heard. Everyone wants to be free." End quote. Desmoulins also tells us what happened next, and it was eventful to say the least. Quote, "Paris was aghast at the dismissal of Necker, yet no one would take up arms in spite of my efforts to galvanize the people to action. About 3 o'clock, I went to the royal palace. I was deploring our lack of courage to a group of people when 3 young men came by, holding hands and shouting, 'Jouarmes! To arms!' I joined them, my enthusiasm quite obvious. I was surrounded and pressed to climb upon a table. There were immediately 6,000 people around me. I was bursting with hundreds of ideas, and spoke without thought. 'To arms!' I cried. 'Let us all wear cockades.' I grabbed a ribbon and pinned it to my hat. My action spread like wildfire. Sound of tumult reached the camp. The cravats, the Swiss, the dragoons, and the Royal Allemand all arrived. The Prince Lambesc, heading the latter, entered the Tuileries on horseback. He personally cut down an unarmed French guard with his sword and knocked over women and children. The crowd became wild with anger, and then there was but a single cry all across Paris. 'To arms!' End quote. There's clearly a lot of figurative language in that quotation, but it really captures the passion of the Citizen Patriots. And I'm afraid this is where the episode must end, right before the climax of July in France. Join us next time as the escalation continues with the storming of the Bastille and much, much more. And if you have any questions, concerns, or corrections, the email address for Everything History is everythinghistorypodcast@gmail.com. That's everythinghistorypodcast@gmail.com.
Thank you very much.